Hello, thanks for joining me. I'm Susie Kahlich. I'm a writer on Medium. I did a session earlier today about learning how to trust yourself and the relationship that I see between my martial arts practice and my writing. I don't, I write a little bit about martial arts, but I mostly write about societal structures and patriarchy and um, kind of looking at different ways to look at the world and how some of the things that I like to explore in my essays are kind of getting down to the very nitty gritty or the root causes of things and how sometimes one person's perspective might influence generations of people or systems and how we might change those. So that's who I am. I was just coming from a really interesting talk by a man named James Dorsey, who was discussing um, the relationship between the growing movement and support of football or soccer in the Middle East and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is very interesting to me. So that was really great. But this is an open Ask Me Anything session. To give you a little bit of background about my writing and my martial arts, feel free to ask me about either of those. I am a born storyteller. I discovered the magic and the power of storytelling actually when I was 8 at a school assembly. That still stays with me, actually, and started publishing when I was in my early 20s. Um, Mostly fiction, poetry. I got into creative nonfiction a little bit later. I've written tons of short stories and poems, done live poetry readings, and have had some plays produced on Broadway, off Broadway, in the Outback, weirdly. Have won some awards in screenwriting. And in fiction writing, I think. So I've been writing for a really, really long time, really most of my life. So I'm in my mid 50s and I started writing. As I said, I understood the power of storytelling when I was 8. So whatever that math is, because I'm not that great at math, and not when it's fast. And yeah, started writing really professionally and thinking about it as a profession when I was around 18. So it's the most of my life. I read voraciously, and of course that informs my writing. It took me a while to understand what my voice was, which I think happens with every writer. I started out kind of mimicking other writers, like Mark Twain, for example. I went through a little Mark Twain period. Um, and that's the writing side of things. The martial arts side of things, I began training in martial arts 23 years ago. The art that I study is called ninjutsu. I trained for 8 years in Los Angeles. I became the first woman in my dojo to earn an instructor's belt. I still train and I still teach, and it's a really big part of my life. I've developed a women's self-defense program based on my martial arts training, as well as my own experiences as a violent crime survivor. And yeah, that's about it. So I am really happy to have discussions or answer any questions about writing style, story structure, character, dialogue. That took me a while to learn how to do and feel comfortable with. I think for the first 7 years of writing, none of my stories, like none of my characters ever said anything. But when I got into screenwriting, of course, they actually had to. So that was an interesting experience. Feel free to ask me anything about martial arts, about self-defense, um, about gender-based violence. Any of these things are things that I'm more than happy to talk about. If you want to ask me a question about something outside that scope, you're more than welcome to. And if I can answer it, I absolutely will. Or perhaps it will start a fascinating discussion, which I'm also happy to have. I think I'm supposed to, now I can't remember where to review the questions. Shoot. There are no questions. So, I see that there's 16 people here, so please feel free also to just jump on the camera with me. That's also always welcome. It's nice to see people's faces. I spent a little time today in the networking session and met a couple of people. And I've attended a few other talks and panel discussions as well. This has been a really wonderfully organized experience, and I really appreciate it. I think it's been great. Yeah, and that's about it. I'm happy to talk about the history of martial arts, if that's interesting to you. The you can't actually see it, it's too far away, but if you've ever seen those little kind of like egg-shaped red dolls in they're Japanese, but sometimes they'll be in Chinese like trinket stores as well, where you're supposed to paint in their eyes. And those are called Daruma dolls. And those are actually about a bodhisattva whose name is Daruma, who came from India. He's called the blue-eyed bodhisattva. And he is actually responsible for bringing martial arts from India to China and then further into Japan. I really love the idea of Daruma because he was the most impatient bodhisattva that I've ever heard of. He was, at some point in a rage, he blinded himself. He poked his own eyes out, which is why the bodhisattva, or why the Daruma doll has no eyes that you have to paint in yourself. Normally, the way that's, in case anyone doesn't know, normally the way that works is you state a money goal, and then when you reach it, when you start it, you paint one eye in, and when you reach it, you paint the other eye in. But actual Daruma, and there is some evidence that he actually existed, apparently in some sort of rage, poked his own eyes out with a hot poker for some reason to try and gain enlightenment or something. But I don't know. I don't really know the whole entire story, but it's very entertaining to me. But it's also interesting that martial arts originally comes from India, and then traveled to China, and then from China into Japan and Korea, and almost every single culture in the world has a martial art, a non-weapon and then later weaponized physical art for defense, which I find really interesting. In Europe, it's mostly called, nowadays it's referred to as historical European martial arts, or HEMA. And there are some really, really fascinating experts to learn from in that sector. So that's also very cool. Happy to talk about that. Yeah, feel free to ask me anything at all. Otherwise, I'm just going to be yammering around. And again, I don't know. Oh, here. Oh, now I can see your questions. I'm sorry. I managed to miss all of them. Let me just approve them all. My apologies. I looked at the wrong thing. And then I'll answer them all. Here we are. Okay. Starting with the first one. Can I see this? Yes. Kim Sullivan, now I can. How does one begin writing about healing after trauma? I'm having difficulties trying to figure an approach, specifically traveling full-time via an RV lifestyle, go you, and how it helped you heal from grief and loss. I feel that writing about trauma and healing from trauma and healing from grief, which these are things I write about as well, for me, it's very rooted in poetry and music. And I find that when I approach it from those particular forms, it's easier for me to access my own emotions. I feel when I'm writing about grief specifically because it's so unformed. Grief is it's just sort of this weird shape that you live in, and sometimes you exit and sometimes you go back in. And so I feel like stream of consciousness writing and unstructured poetry is a really great way to start accessing it, even if it's not the ultimate way that you will express yourself. But I think with both of these things, you need a lot of room and no restrictions. I feel that you're doing yourself a disservice and others as well if you try and keep it into really strict formats, at least while you're exploring it. A lot of times when people write about their own trauma and their own grief, and this is true for myself as well, obviously part of that process is healing and exploring. And I think that it really helps others as well to just give room to it and let it lead you. I think has been my way to approach it. And it can be as simple as just starting with one word on a page. But again, I tend to approach it more from poetry and music. That's again an easier way for me to access that. Ashley Howell is saying, I was in a different talk and I think you have to approve the questions. Yes, thank you very much. I figured that out. And Corey Miller is asking, what martial arts have I studied? So I am very dedicated to ninjutsu. I've played around in a few other martial arts here and there, just because it's fun to play around in different martial arts. But I really love ninjutsu. It's endless. My teacher, who's in his 80s, has been studying ninjutsu for 60 years. And he still just discovers it really is endless. I think that's probably true of every martial art. And it's really kind of what resonates with you most. I've played around a little bit with Bagua, which is a form of Kung Fu. A friend of mine in Paris does that. And his teacher is also a really great teacher. Of course, I've dabbled a little bit in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I think I took half a Krav Maga course once. I've played around a bit with karate, Osaka karate, and Aikido. There's a lot of crossover with any of the Japanese arts. There's a lot of crossover between them. There are elements of judo in ninjutsu, so I have 2 judo throws that I can do. I haven't really done taekwondo, and I am curious to try eskrima. And I'm curious to play around with Sistema as well, which is a Russian martial art. Where is the most interesting place I have been and why? That's a really good question. In May, I was in Pakistan, and that was really interesting because I was there at the moment that the country was going through a really massive political upheaval. And it was frightening. I understood that I was in danger, not because anyone was focused on me initially, but it was a very violent unrest that went on for about somewhere between 5 and 7 days. And I knew eventually if I stuck around, people would turn, I represent a colonial power, even if they don't know exactly where I come from. But nonetheless, I just by looks, I represent a colonial power, and that would only add fuel to the fire. So I knew that I was in danger there. I was arriving in Islamabad as everything was exploding, so I had to sort of take an emergency hotel. And I met some other people who had been in these situations many, many times. There were people who work for really large NGOs. And they were kind of weirdly excited about it, and I got the sense that for for combat journalists and people who work in the field in NGOs, especially in conflict zones or crisis zones, you can taste the adrenaline and you get a buzz from it. Absolutely. And then you trauma bond with people. And I could see the appeal, like it was all sort of unfurling for me. And I thought, oh, I could stay and I could trauma bond and I could like be one of these cool people and my life could go on a different path. But I also thought, I think it can be really hard to get off of that path. And I've certainly heard of some people where it's it can get really what's the word I'm looking for? Not abusive, but it can get really, really unhealthy for the person who's kind of addicted to that type of adrenaline. So I hope that answers your question about the most interesting place I've been. But I don't know if Pakistan was the most interesting because I feel like I didn't get to really, really experience it. I would say, while I'm seeing if anyone else is asking questions, the year before I was in Nepal and that was interesting. I was there to work, and I was in Kathmandu. What was interesting for me about Nepal was one of my last days there, where I was very, very lucky that one of the people I was working with, who's Hindu, kind of snuck me in through the back entrance of this large Hindu temple in Kathmandu, which is the largest place outside of India, I think, where people are, go through like, funeral pyres and there's a river where ashes are thrown, like the Ganges. So we got to see, or I got to see funerals, people in different stages of being put on funeral pyres and what that was like. But before that, we had been to the largest Buddhist site in the world outside of Tibet, which is also in Kathmandu. Then we went to the Hindu temple, and this was at the end of November. So all the expats in Kathmandu were having a Christmas market, and we ended the day at this Christmas market, which was just weird. So we hit like three of the world's major religions in the same, or major belief systems in the same day, and I'm not a very religious person, but it was really one of the most profound days of my life, I would say. So interesting place, it would be Nepal, at least for that one day. Interesting situation would be Pakistan, but I hope that that's only so far, and that there's more to come. I don't think there's any other questions at the moment, but now that I've got it figured out, thank you everyone for your help in trying to get that figured out, since I did a horrible job. But please feel free to ask any more. Let's see, to kind of give you more information about myself. Weirdly, I don't really write about travel very much. I'm not a travel writer, and I don't enjoy writing about travel. I enjoy taking photos, but I just don't really enjoy writing about it. I think the farthest east I've been has been to China, to Shenzhen and Shanghai. And the farthest in the Middle East I've been has been the middle of Turkey, so not much farther than that. And then Southeast Asia, Nepal, and Pakistan. I still have yet to discover the entire Earth south of the equator. And I of course continue to travel as much as I possibly can. But yeah, I don't really like to write about it. But travel for me, it just informs everything else. It informs my stories. It informs my creative nonfiction. It informs my martial arts practice as well. And the reason I travel is actually to teach self-defense. So obviously it informs that too. Yeah. So, oh, great. Thanks for more questions. They kind of all came at the same time. And I'm just approving them before I go back to answering them. Everett Goldner says, what is the primary focus of ninjutsu? Stealth, speed, stamina, being deadly as fuck, or something else? That's a really good question. I actually would say none of those. The primary focus of ninjutsu is, for me, I think it's the primary focus of any martial art. It's really just to get to know yourself. It's a way of learning through the body and allowing your body to lead you, learning to trust your body as a vehicle so much that it can lead you and teach you. Ultimately, my goal in ninjutsu, and I think it is the primary focus of ninjutsu, is to defend without defending. How do you do that? What does that look like? That's something that I'm still exploring. I don't know yet. I've talked to my teacher about it, and some of my other teachers, and they are very tight-lipped about that because they're ninjas, and apparently that's a secret that they don't want to share right now. Um, when you're in martial arts for a really long time, and maybe you already are, Everett, and I don't know, so excuse me, I don't mean to be talking down to you. But if you are, then you'll already know this. But when you're in martial arts for a long time, it becomes so personal and so much of how you move through the world that I just think I think it's really just another path to the same destination as things like yoga and meditation and even, more structured religion and music and arts and all of those things. It's nice to be I'm not fast, by the way. It's nice to have stamina and stealth and be deadly, but I think you evolve past that in your training after a point, and that's no longer the focus. What the focus is like, what else can I discover? Corey asks, how has my experience in martial arts training changed over time as a woman? That's really interesting, Corey, because I started martial arts when I was 32, and now I'm 55. So I've also my body has been through changes. I don't have kids, so I didn't get pregnant and have children, but of course I've been through perimenopause and menopause. And that has absolutely changed how I relate to the art and how the art relates to me personally. But as a woman in the field of martial arts, which is a very, very male dominated field, it's a little friendlier now. There's more women. When I started, there were other women who started around the same time, and we probably all reached black belt at the same time, but we weren't connected. So when I first left my dojo, the first time I met another woman black belt, I was like, "Oh, there's more of us." I was so excited. Now there's even more, which is great, and the women my age and a little bit younger are now starting to teach, which I really love. The domain of martial arts is it's pretty misogynistic and sexist, and it can be really toxic and homophobic and racist, and it's not a very welcoming place. A lot of these elements have not changed, unfortunately, which it really pains me because there's so much good to be gotten from martial arts, and that kind of gatekeeping is the basest kind of gatekeeping and kind of contradicts what I believe martial arts stands for. But it has gotten a bit easier, and because I'm a bit older, I'm also treated differently than I was when I started at 32. So I don't know if that answers all your questions, but I hope so. There's a bunch more, so I will approve them. But it's hard to keep up with these. Pat Fergan says, any suggestions about dealing with rude, condescending healthcare providers? And goes on to explain medical providers who are uncomfortable dealing with chronic physical issues stemming from complex PTSD. I simply lower my voice and make a very plain statement. And that's kind of how I deal with it. So here in Berlin, people who work in medical offices are, especially women, it's unfortunately always women who are like the people who do the intake. And they're very territorial, and they can make it really hard for you. And they're kind of the gatekeeper before the doctor. So they set the tone for the doctor often. And I found that the best thing to do is to counter them with their own stubbornness and to just say things like, well, this is what it is and this is what I want. And just to be very calm and even and stick to my statement. I feel like I don't know where you are, Pat. So if you're in the United States, it might be a lot harder because of the medical industry there, but in the health industry in general. But I also feel like being willing to walk away from people and just say, fine, I don't need you. You know, I'm going to go find another doctor. That is also, I think it's important to feel empowered enough to do that because obviously you know your body best, and you know what you want to address, and you really need to find people who are going to listen to you and listen to you seriously. Kat C says, do you have a repeating ceremony when I start writing something? Or like a ceremony in general? Well, yeah, actually, I do. I have a ceremony that is mostly procrastination. I clean my house first. I do the dishes. I used to smoke, so I used to call it like the three S, sort of the three S's: smoke, shower, and then what was the other one? Snack. Smoke, shower, and snack before I sit down to write. There's always snacks involved, unfortunately, and especially since I stopped smoking. Yeah, so now it's cleaning. There's usually like 5 days of arguments in my head. There's an emotional little roller coaster that I go through that often includes like one period of unjustified anger at any random person in my life that I have learned to not actually act out on because that just causes trouble. I don't know why I have to go through all this stuff to sit down and write, but that's been the process for a while. So I hate to say it feels weird to call it a ceremony because it feels kind of negative, but it's definitely my process. Once I'm in, I'm in. Once I start writing, then I, get into that world and I really don't want to come out. But getting into that world, it's like I feel like a golden retriever being dragged across the bathroom floor to be stuck in the tub, who doesn't want a bath. Andy Chang asks, did I hike in Nepal? You heard it's easy to visit the Himalayas there. Yes, it is easy. No, I did not hike because I was working the entire time in Kathmandu and didn't really get the opportunity to leave and go hiking. So unfortunately, but I would like to go back and hike the Himalayas, or at least go to base camp of Mount Everest. That would be really interesting. I don't think Mount Everest is in. I think I'm saying the wrong one because I'm really terrible at geography. Corey Miller is asking, for the first time in years, I'm training in a dojo that's balanced between male, female, black belts. It's been very different training with women. Do I find training with women to be different, more rewarding, less power driven? No. I mean, humans are humans, I think it really depends on the personality. I think if you're training at black belt level, ideally, everyone will also embody some of the principles of being a black belt, which is putting your ego aside, not trying to prove your point on somebody else's body, not trying to dominate or worry about territory, but more explore and play and be curious. But I've met women who don't embody those things. I've met men who don't embody those things. I don't feel that is, especially at black belt level, I don't feel that there's too much of a gender difference. I think the gender difference really lies in the actual bodies, bigger, smaller, more muscular, less muscular. Where is the center of balance, which are a little bit different. And of course, women have breasts. So, training with people with different chest sizes also can be a challenge at times. But yeah, otherwise I don't feel that I've never experienced it where it's like where I can make a statement Um, that's 99% true, where it's like, women are always more rewarding or always less power driven or more power driven or whatever. It's really, again, at black belt level, I think it's really to the individual. The one thing that I have found training with women at black belt level especially is we are, at least the women that I've met, we're a little more willing to go all out with each other, whereas men sometimes still hold back. I have a couple of guys that I train with where we can get really rough with each other, but a lot of men that I meet or even know that I train with regularly still hold back on themselves. Um, Meeting women occasionally who are really, and you train, if you've been training a long time, you know how far you can push it before you get to a danger point. And meeting someone that I can train with at like almost full power, who's equal to me in size and strength and speed and everything else, is a blast. And it's such a gift to be able to do that. I think maybe that might be the only real difference that I've seen, but I think that's about it. Um, oh, I'm at the end already. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. I really appreciate it. I really have appreciated your questions and your comments and the discussion with all of you. Please, please feel free to follow me on Medium. Reach out to me in the networking, or feel free to send me an email. The easiest way to find me is at my company's website, which is prettydeadlyselfdefense.com. It's pretty easy to find. And thank you so much. I hope to chat with all of you and get to know your writing and your all the amazing things that you do too. I really appreciate you being here. Have a good rest of the session.